The room went silent so fast I could hear the ice shifting inside someone's whiskey glass. My father stood at the head of the dining table, one hand flat against the polished mahogany, the other pointing directly at the front door like he was ordering a criminal out of court. "Get out," he said. His voice echoed beneath the crystal chandelier. Then louder. "And don't come back." 22 people froze. My mother stopped breathing mid-sip of wine. My sister lowered her eyes into her champagne glass to hide the satisfaction on her face. My younger brother stared at his plate like if he stayed perfectly still he wouldn't be forced to choose a side. No one defended me. Not one person. Not even my grandfather, the retired Marine who once told me courage mattered more than approval. Outside, thunder rolled across the Florida sky. Inside, my father looked at me like I was the greatest embarrassment of his 70 years on Earth. What none of them knew, what not one person sitting at that table knew, was that the daughter they had spent years calling a disappointment quietly owned $35 million. And in less than 24 hours I would disappear from their world completely. But 2 weeks later, they'd all learn my name. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and on the night my father threw me out of the family home, I realized something that changed me forever. Some people don't actually want you to succeed. They only want you to succeed in ways that make them comfortable. The dinner took place on October 12, 2025, at exactly 7:18 p.m. My parents' house sat on the edge of Naples, Florida, inside one of those gated communities where every lawn looked chemically perfect, and every driveway held at least one German luxury car. My father loved that neighborhood, said it reflected standards. Everything with Richard Bennett was about standards. Standards of appearance, standards of achievement, standards of reputation. And according to him, I had failed every single one. The official reason for the gathering was my grandfather Walter's 70th birthday, retired Marine Corps colonel, Vietnam veteran. The kind of man who still ironed his shirts himself and stood when the national anthem played, even if it came from a television in a sports bar. When I was 12, he gave me my first compass. When I was 16, he taught me how to shoot. When I was 22 and graduating from West Point, he was the only person in the family who looked proud instead of disappointed. My father called it a phase. That was 12 years ago. The dining room smelled like rosemary expensive steak, and the faint salt air drifting in from the patio doors. My mother had hired caterers. Of course she had. Susan Bennett believed suffering should always look elegant from the outside. She wore pearls even at breakfast. My sister Amelia sat beside her husband near the center of the table. Amelia was 40, a pediatric surgeon with 2 magazine covers, and a social media account full of smiling children and charity galas. My mother mentioned her accomplishments the way other women talked about their grandchildren. My younger brother Ethan worked for a hedge fund in New York, 30 years old, already making more money annually than most people saw in 10 years. My father adored him because Ethan knew how to network, how to dress, how to shake hands properly at country club events. And then there was me, Major Claire Bennett, United States Army Intelligence, Bronze Star recipient, 3 overseas deployments, and according to my father, a woman wasting her life working for the government. I arrived at 6:52 p.m. in my black SUV after driving 3 hours from Fort Liberty. I wore dark jeans boots and a cream sweater because my mother once told me my uniform made dinner guests uncomfortable. "You don't have to look so military all the time," she'd said. Like service was something embarrassing. The first thing I noticed when I walked inside was the wall of family photographs in the hallway. Amelia's medical school graduation. Ethan shaking hands with some senator. My parents at charity events. My grandfather in his Marine uniform. There were 37 framed photographs on that wall. None of me. Not one. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds too long because my mother suddenly appeared beside me holding a wine glass. "You made it," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "That's nice." Nice. Not "I missed you," not "how are you," just nice. Her eyes moved quickly over my clothes. "At least you didn't wear combat boots this time." "I am wearing combat boots." Her smile tightened. "Well, let's try to have a pleasant evening." That was my mother's specialty, turning insults into table manners. Dinner started at 7:15 sharp because my father believed lateness was moral weakness. I was seated near the far end of the table beside two teenage cousins and Aunt Linda, who spent 20 straight minutes talking about Botox and property taxes. Amelia and Ethan sat close to my father near the center like members of a board meeting. Hierarchy mattered in our family. Everything was placement. Everything was signals. Halfway through dinner, my father stood to toast my grandfather. To Walter, he said, lifting his glass. A real American. A man who understood discipline, sacrifice, and legacy. Everyone applauded. My grandfather nodded once. Then my father smiled toward Amelia. And speaking of legacy, Amelia was recently invited to join the surgical advisory board at Johns Hopkins. Applause again. My mother dabbed at her eyes dramatically. She worked so hard she whispered to nobody specifically. Ethan announced his firm had just closed some enormous acquisition deal in Chicago. More admiration, more praise. Then the silence came. That slow, dangerous silence. My father looked at me from across the table. And Claire, he said, there it was. I set my fork down carefully. Yes. What exactly is your long-term plan here? I already knew this wasn't a question. It was an ambush. I'm not sure what you mean. You're 34 years old, he said. Still unmarried. Still living base to base. Still taking orders from people half as intelligent as you are. Amelia shifted slightly in her chair but said nothing. You graduated from West Point, he continued. You could have gone into law, politics, corporate leadership. God knows Ethan's company would have hired you instantly. Instead, you disappear overseas for months at a time doing... He waved his hand vaguely, whatever it is you people do. We protect national security, I said calmly. He laughed once under his breath. You collect a government paycheck. The table got quiet. Very quiet. I could feel Ethan staring at his wine glass. My grandfather's jaw tightened slightly. I should explain something important. For years, my family believed I was financially unstable. That was intentional. What they didn't know was that during my second deployment overseas, I'd started investing heavily into defense technology and cybersecurity infrastructure. Quietly, aggressively. I understood military logistics intelligence systems, drone mapping, battlefield AI. I saw where modern warfare was going before Wall Street did. By 2025, my investment portfolio alone was worth $35 million. But I never told them. Because after a while, letting people underestimate you becomes useful. My father leaned back in his chair. You know what your problem is, Claire. No, Dad, tell me. You mistake stubbornness for independence. My mother sighed softly like she'd rehearsed this moment. Your father and I only want what's best for you. There's an opening at the firm, my father continued. My partner's son just made equity, smart guy, divorced but stable. You could finally settle down, have a normal life. A normal life. I actually smiled. That's what this is about. It's about reality, he snapped. You're not 22 anymore playing soldier. The room shifted. That sentence landed hard. Playing soldier. After Afghanistan, after funerals, after folded flags handed to widows. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That always happened before anger fully arrived. I'm not leaving the army. My father stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then he stood up. Slowly. If you walk away from this opportunity, he said, then don't expect this family to continue supporting your bad decisions. I never asked for support. No, he barked. You demanded tolerance. Silence. Thunder cracked outside the windows. Then came the moment. The one I'd replay later at 3 in the morning while staring at the ceiling of my Florida mansion. Get out, my father said. Nobody moved. Dad Ethan started quietly. I said, get out. His finger pointed toward the door. And don't come back. I didn't argue. That's the part people always expect to hear differently when they learn the story later. They imagine screaming, crying, plates shattering against walls, one final dramatic speech before the daughter storms into the rain. But real humiliation rarely looks cinematic while it's happening. Most of the time it looks quiet. I stood slowly from my chair while 22 people avoided eye contact with me. The only sound in the room was the soft clink of silverware against china and the distant hum of thunder rolling over the Gulf. My mother stared down at her napkin. Amelia crossed one leg over the other and reached for her wine like nothing unusual had happened. Ethan looked sick. My grandfather Walter was the only person who looked directly at me, but even he stayed silent. That hurt more than my father yelling. Because silence from strangers feels normal. Silence from people you love feels like betrayal. I grabbed my keys from the table near the entryway and walked toward the front door, 23 steps from dining room to exit. I counted every single one because focusing on numbers kept me from falling apart. As I reached the handle, my father spoke one last time. "You'll thank me someday." I almost laughed. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The Florida air hit me warm and wet. Rain soaked through my sweater within seconds as lightning flashed somewhere over the ocean. I walked to my SUV without looking back once. Not because I was strong. Because I knew if I turned around and saw nobody following me, something inside me might break permanently. I drove south on Interstate 75 with the windshield wipers moving violently back and forth across the glass. My phone buzzed twice in the cup holder. First from my mother. "Please don't make tonight more dramatic than it already was." Then from Ethan. "I'm sorry." That was it. Not Dad was wrong, not come back, just I'm sorry. I didn't reply to either of them. By 10:14 p.m., I crossed onto the private bridge leading toward Marco Island. The rain had slowed to a soft coastal mist by then, and the dark water below reflected scattered lights from boats rocking gently in the marina. Most people in my family believed I rented a small apartment near base housing outside Fort Liberty. In reality, I owned a 7-bedroom waterfront estate hidden behind palm trees and white stone gates, less than 80 miles from my parents' house. I bought it 3 years earlier through an LLC. Cash. The security gate opened automatically as my SUV rolled forward onto the curved driveway. The mansion rose out of the darkness in soft, golden light, white stucco walls, black iron balconies, towering glass windows facing the water. Peace. That was the first thing I felt every time I came here. Peace. No expectations, no comparisons, no judgment disguised as concern. Just silence in the ocean. I parked beneath the covered entrance and sat there for a moment with both hands still gripping the steering wheel. Rainwater slid slowly down the windshield while my breathing finally started to shake. I hadn't cried at the house. I cried then. Not loudly. Just quietly with my forehead against the steering wheel while 20 years of emotional exhaustion pressed against my ribs like weight underwater. Because the truth was, a small part of me had spent my entire adult life hoping my father would someday look at me the way he looked at Amelia. Proud, certain, soft around the eyes. But Richard Bennett only respected versions of success he understood. And daughters like me made men like him uncomfortable. Women who carried authority, women who disappeared overseas, women who didn't ask permission before building lives bigger than the ones chosen for them. At 10:31 p.m., my phone rang again. "Grandpa Walter." I stared at the screen for 4 full seconds before answering. "Hey, Grandpa." The line stayed quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "You okay, kid?" That almost broke me again. Because he was the first person all night who sounded like he actually cared about the answer. "I'm fine." That's a Marine answer. "You were Army," I said softly. "Still a better liar than you." I smiled despite myself. Outside waves crashed gently against the private dock below the terrace. "I should have said something tonight," he admitted finally. "Yes," I whispered. "You should have." Another long silence. At 80 years old, Walter Bennett still sounded dangerous when he got quiet. "Your father's angry because he can't control you," he said. "Men like Richard confuse obedience with love." I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. "He thinks I wasted my life." "No," Grandpa said. "He thinks you wasted the life he picked for you." That sentence stayed with me. Still does. After we hung up, I carried my overnight bag inside the mansion. The marble floors were cool beneath my boots. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the black water beyond the dock where my 38-foot boat rocked gently beneath moonlight, finally breaking through the storm clouds. Most nights, this place felt like victory. That night, it felt lonely. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and walked barefoot onto the terrace. Salt air drifted through the dark while the last of the rain disappeared into the ocean breeze. Then my phone buzzed again. An email this time. Sender, Department of Defense. Subject line: confirmation of attendance, National Veterans Leadership, Gala. I opened it immediately. Major Claire Bennett. We are honored to confirm your attendance and recognition at this year's National Veterans Leadership Gala in Washington, D.C. on October 26, 2025. Lieutenant General Raymond Holt will formally announce your appointment to the Defense Innovation Advisory Council in recognition of your contributions to military cybersecurity infrastructure and veterans support initiatives. A black tie reception will follow. Media attendance confirmed. I stared at the screen. 2 weeks. In exactly 2 weeks, my name would be announced publicly beside one of the most respected generals in the United States military. National television coverage, defense contractors, political leaders, press. And somewhere inside Naples, Florida? My father still thought I was a disappointment sleeping in a cheap apartment outside a military base. I laughed quietly into the night. Not because it was funny, because life has a strange sense of timing sometimes. Then another email arrived. This one from my financial advisor. Subject: finalized acquisition complete. I opened the attachment. The cybersecurity company I'd invested in 5 years earlier had officially completed its acquisition that morning. My net worth had just increased by another $8.4 million. Total estimated portfolio value $35.2 million. I stared out across the dark ocean and thought about my father telling me to find a stable man and a normal life. Then I looked around the mansion I owned outright. The dock, the water, the silence, the freedom. And for the first time in years, I realized I no longer wanted their approval badly enough to keep shrinking myself for it. But 2 weeks later, they were all going to learn something important. The daughter they threw away. She had become far more powerful than any of them understood. The first crack appeared 3 days later at the Naples Harbor Country Club. That detail matters because men like my father treated country clubs like unofficial kingdoms. Business deals happened there. Reputations lived or died there. People smiled politely to your face while quietly measuring your net worth, your children, your marriage, your mistakes. Especially your mistakes. At 11:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning, my father was finishing a round of golf with 3 other attorneys when one of them pulled out his phone beside the clubhouse bar. "Richard," the man said, squinting at the screen, "is this your daughter?" My father looked irritated before he even looked curious. According to Ethan later, he probably assumed someone had found an old deployment photo online. Then the attorney turned the screen around. And everything changed. The article headline read, "Army Major Quietly Builds Multi-million-dollar Defense Tech Portfolio." Underneath was a professional photograph taken 6 months earlier during a cybersecurity summit in Arlington. I was wearing a dark blazer instead of a uniform, speaking on stage beside a retired 4-star general. Calm, confident, nothing like the unstable disappointment my family had described for years. The article itself wasn't even national news yet. It came from a military business journal most civilians never read. But inside defense circles, people paid attention. Especially wealthy older men suddenly realizing the daughter they dismissed might be more successful than their own children. My father reportedly stared at the phone long enough for the bartender to ask if he wanted another drink. The attorney laughed softly. "Hell of a portfolio your daughter built." My father's jaw tightened. She never mentioned any of this. That part was true, because my family never asked questions unless the answers supported the story they already preferred. The article mentioned my advisory work with military cybersecurity firms, my early investments into drone infrastructure, the Veterans Housing Initiative I quietly funded in North Carolina. It even referenced my ownership stake in Black Harbor Systems, the defense AI company that had finalized its acquisition earlier that week. Estimated portfolio value $35 million. The number hit my father like a physical blow. Not because he suddenly respected money more than service. Because for the first time in his life he realized he had completely misunderstood me. And worse, other people knew it too. By that afternoon, Naples started whispering. Small cities full of wealthy retirees operate like elegant gossip machines. Women talked during tennis lessons. Men discussed it over bourbon and seafood towers. Somebody's wife forwarded the article into a neighborhood social group by 3:08 p.m. By dinner, everyone knew. The calls started almost immediately. At 5:17 p.m., my mother left her first voicemail. "Claire, sweetheart, Apparently there's an article circulating online. Your father and I were surprised. We wish you would have told us about all this. Not we're proud of you, not we were wrong. Just we were surprised. I deleted the voicemail. At 6:03 p.m. Amelia texted me. Congratulations, I guess. I stared at those 3 cold words for several seconds before putting the phone face down on the kitchen counter. Jealousy sounds different depending on the person speaking it. With Amelia, it always sounded polished. The following morning, my mother attempted damage control. That woman could organize emotional denial like military logistics. At exactly 9:11 a.m., she posted a photograph on Facebook from years earlier, me in dress uniform at West Point graduation, standing beside my parents. Caption: Always proud of our Claire. Service intelligence and dedication have always defined her. So exciting seeing her accomplishments recognized nationally. Within minutes, comments flooded in. Susan, I had no idea your daughter was involved in defense technology. You must be incredibly proud. Wait, wasn't this the daughter Richard threw out at dinner last month? That comment disappeared within 3 minutes. Then another appeared. I thought Claire was still figuring things out. That's what you told everyone at Easter. Deleted. Then another. Funny how successful daughters become easier to claim. Deleted. Screenshots, however, live forever. By noon, people across Naples were quietly discussing my parents the way people discuss families after scandals. The respected Bennett suddenly looked less respectable. And the thing about humiliation. Once society smells it, people rarely look away. Meanwhile, I spent those days exactly the way I always had. Working. At 6 o'clock every morning, I sat on the terrace overlooking the water with coffee and financial reports spread across my tablet. By noon, I was usually in video meetings with cybersecurity firms or veterans' housing organizations. Money had never actually been the point. Freedom was. The freedom to walk away, the freedom to choose, the freedom to never sit at another dinner table begging for respect. On October 20th, 6 days before the gala in Washington, I finalized a donation I'd been quietly planning for almost a year. $5 million. The money funded transitional housing and mental health support programs for disabled veterans across North Carolina and Virginia, specifically for soldiers struggling after returning home from deployment. I didn't attach my family name to it. No Bennett Foundation, no elegant plaque. Just the Claire Bennett Veterans Initiative. Simple. Direct. Real. The press release hit national media 2 days later. That's when things truly exploded. Fox News ran a short morning segment about the Army intelligence officer turned defense investor funding veterans programs nationwide. CNN picked up the story online by afternoon. Then came the sentence that completely shattered whatever remained of my father's version of reality. Self-made millionaire and decorated Army officer Claire Bennett. Self-made. Not family money, not inheritance, not help from Richard Bennett. Self-made. That word matters deeply to older Americans, especially older men who built identities around achievement. The phone rang again around sunset that evening. This time it was Ethan. I answered after the 4th ring. You're famous now, he said quietly. I leaned against the terrace railing overlooking the ocean. Apparently. He hesitated. I didn't know Claire. I know. No, he said softly, I really didn't know. For a second he sounded younger, like the little brother who used to wait outside my room during thunderstorms when he was afraid at night. How bad is it there? I asked. I heard him exhale slowly. Dad's pretending he's proud. Mom's trying to control the gossip. Amelia's furious. That almost made me laugh. She'll survive. She thinks everyone's comparing her to you now. I looked out toward the dock lights reflecting against dark water. They always compared us, I said. She just liked the direction better before. Silence. Then Ethan lowered his voice. There's something else. What? Dad got invited to the Naples Legacy Charity Gala next weekend. I frowned slightly. So, the keynote military guest just got announced. I already knew before he said it. You. The ocean wind moved softly through my hair. And somewhere 80 miles north of me, my father had just realized the daughter he threw out of his house was about to become the most important person in a room full of people whose approval he spent his entire life chasing. The Naples Legacy Charity Gala took place on October 26, 2025, inside the ballroom of the Bellamy Grand Resort overlooking the Gulf Coast. My father loved that hotel because it represented everything he respected: money, exclusivity, polished appearances, men in tailored tuxedos, women with diamond bracelets catching light beneath crystal chandeliers, expensive laughter echoing over piano music while servers carried trays of champagne through crowds pretending not to judge one another. The irony of that night wasn't lost on me. 2 weeks earlier, Richard Bennett had thrown me out of his home like I was an embarrassment to the family name. Now his entire social circle was waiting to hear me speak. I arrived at 7:04 p.m. in a black SUV provided by the Department of Defense, not because I requested it, because protocol required it once General Holt confirmed attendance. The moment the vehicle stopped beneath the covered entrance, cameras started flashing. I stepped out wearing my army dress uniform. Dark blue fabric perfectly pressed, bronze star ribbon above my heart, intelligence insignia gleaming beneath ballroom lights, my hair pulled back clean and professional, calm expression, steady posture. Years earlier, my mother once told me military uniforms made people uncomfortable at dinner parties. Funny thing was, that night it made everyone stare. The ballroom quieted almost immediately as I entered. Not completely silent, more like a ripple spreading through water, conversations lowering, heads turning, people recognizing me from articles and television segments they'd spent the last week forwarding to one another. I spotted my parents near the center of the ballroom beside a group of local donors and business owners. My mother's face froze first, then my father's. For a second he genuinely looked disoriented, like his brain couldn't fully connect the daughter he'd screamed at with the woman walking into the gala surrounded by military officials and media attention. Amelia stood beside them in a silver gown, jaw tightening visibly the moment cameras pivoted toward me instead of her. Ethan surprisingly smiled. Just slightly. The event organizer hurried across the room toward me with nervous excitement. "Major Bennett," she said breathlessly, "we're honored to have you here tonight. Not long ago, people in my family introduced me as Claire works for the government. Now strangers were calling me Major Bennett like the title actually meant something. Because suddenly it did. Funny how respect works once other people approve first." As I moved farther into the ballroom, older veterans began approaching one after another. A retired Navy commander shook my hand and thanked me for funding veterans' housing programs. A Gold Star widow hugged me with tears in her eyes because her son finally received counseling through one of the initiatives I financed. A former Marine with a cane quietly said, "Most rich people donate for publicity. You donated before anybody knew your name." That mattered more to me than every dollar attached to my portfolio. Because service, not money, was still the center of who I was. At 7:42 p.m., the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight we recognize leadership, sacrifice, and commitment to the people who served this country." Polite applause filled the room. Then he smiled toward me. "And now please welcome Lieutenant General Raymond Holt." The room stood immediately. General Holt entered in full dress uniform, silver hair immaculate beneath the lights. Even civilians understood instinctively when someone carried that level of authority. He shook my hand firmly before stepping to the podium. "For 30 years," he began, "I've watched brave men and women dedicate themselves to this country. But every so often you meet someone who continues serving long after the battlefield." The ballroom grew completely still. General Holt looked directly toward me. "Major Claire Bennett has spent over a decade serving this nation through military intelligence operations, cybersecurity advancement, and veterans advocacy." A massive screen behind the stage illuminated with photographs from my deployments. Afghanistan, Kuwait, Poland. Then images of veterans housing projects funded through my initiative. The room watched silently. Even my father. Especially my father. General Holt continued. "After returning from overseas assignments, Major Bennett quietly built one of the nation's most influential defense technology investment portfolios, while funding housing counseling and recovery programs for veterans across the United States." Quiet murmurs spread through the ballroom. Because hearing $35 million in articles was one thing. Hearing a 3-star general publicly praise the daughter Richard Bennett threw out of his house, that hit differently. Then came the moment that changed everything permanently. Tonight, General Holt said the Department of Defense is proud to announce Major Claire Bennett's appointment to the Defense Innovation Advisory Council. Applause exploded across the ballroom. Real applause. The kind you feel physically. People stood. Some cheering, some stunned. Cameras flashed nonstop now. And in the center of all that noise, I looked directly at my father. His face had gone pale. Not angry anymore. Not arrogant. Just shaken. Because at that exact moment, Richard Bennett realized something devastating. The daughter he dismissed had become someone the country respected more than he ever would be. General Holt stepped aside and gestured toward the stage. "Major Bennett," he said warmly, "would you join me?" I walked forward slowly while applause continued around me. My heels clicked softly against the ballroom floor. Every eye in the room followed me. Especially my family's. When I reached the podium, the applause finally settled into silence. I looked out across the ballroom. At the donors, the veterans, the cameras, my parents. Then I spoke. When I first joined the Army, I said calmly, "Someone told me service only matters if people understand it." The room stayed completely still. I spent years believing I needed to explain myself, why I chose this path, why I kept serving, why I built the life I built. I paused briefly. But eventually I realized something important. I looked directly at my father. "You do not need permission to become the person you were meant to be." Silence. Sharp, heavy, perfect. "I've seen extraordinary people sacrifice everything for this country," I continued. "People who came home invisible, forgotten. So if I've built anything worthwhile, I hope it's this, the reminder that dignity should never depend on somebody else's approval." A woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes. Across the ballroom, my mother looked like she could barely breathe. And my father, for the first time in my entire life, he looked small. After the speech ended, applause thundered through the ballroom again. General Holt leaned toward me quietly as cameras flashed. "You handled that with more grace than most people would." I smiled faintly. "Military training." But the night wasn't finished yet. Because humiliation doesn't fully land until people start treating you differently afterward. And all around the ballroom, people who once ignored me were now surrounding my father, asking the same question over and over again. "Richard, why didn't you ever tell us your daughter was extraordinary?" 3 days after the gala, my parents showed up at my front gate. I knew they were there before the security intercom buzzed, because my house manager, Elena, came quietly into the kitchen with the careful expression people wear before delivering uncomfortable news. "Miss Bennett," she said softly, "there's a black Mercedes at the gate." I looked up from my laptop. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "Your parents." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the espresso machine behind me, and waves breaking softly somewhere beyond the terrace windows. I had imagined this moment before. Not dramatically, not with revenge fantasies or speeches rehearsed in mirrors. Just brief flashes late at night when old memories refused to stay buried. Would they apologize? Would my father finally admit he was wrong? Would my mother cry? Would any of it actually matter? The strange thing was, now that the moment had arrived, I felt almost nothing. No anger, no excitement, just distance. "Do they have an appointment?" I asked calmly. Elena almost smiled. "No, ma'am." Of course they didn't. People like Richard Bennett never believed boundaries applied to them. I closed my laptop slowly and stared out across the water. Morning sunlight reflected against the gulf in soft silver patterns, while boats drifted peacefully near the marina. This house had become something important to me over the past few years. Not because of the money, because it was the first place in my life where nobody expected me to become someone else. "Let them in," I said finally. My parents entered the house 4 minutes later. My mother walked in first, wearing a cream-colored blouse and oversized sunglasses, despite being indoors. My father followed beside her in a navy blazer, even though Florida heat made jackets ridiculous half the year. They both stopped just inside the foyer. And I watched it happen. That subtle shift people experience when they realize someone else built a life without them. The marble staircase, the ocean beyond the glass walls, the artwork, the quiet confidence of the space itself. My father looked around the mansion slowly, like he was searching for evidence that it somehow wasn't real. "This is," my mother began softly. "Yes," I interrupted, "it is." Neither of them knew how to start. That surprised me more than anything. Richard Bennett always had words, opinions, judgments, instructions. But standing inside my home, my actual life seemed to disorient him. Finally, my mother removed her sunglasses. "We should have come sooner," she said quietly. There it was. Not "we were wrong." Just "we should have handled timing better." I leaned lightly against the kitchen island. "You threw me out of your house." My father inhaled sharply. "Claire." "No," I said calmly. "You don't get to skip over that part because people applauded me at a gala." Silence settled heavily across the room. Outside, wind moved gently through the palm trees lining the water. My mother clasped her hands together tightly. "We didn't understand what you were building." I almost laughed. "That's because neither of you ever asked." My father shifted uncomfortably. "We worried about you." "No," I said. "You worried about appearances." That landed. Hard. Because deep down they both knew it was true. I walked slowly toward the terrace windows overlooking the Gulf. For years I continued quietly. You introduced Ethan as the future of finance, Amelia as the brilliant surgeon, and me, I turned back toward them. I was the daughter, still figuring things out. My mother looked down immediately. "You made me feel like my service embarrassed you." "That's not fair," my father snapped automatically. I stared at him. "Isn't it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because what exactly could he say? That he respected military service, but not when his daughter chose it over corporate prestige. That he admired sacrifice as long as it looked good framed on somebody else's wall. My father rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "The night of the dinner," he began carefully, "I was angry. You were cruel." Another silence. Then something unexpected happened. My father sat down. Not dramatically, not weakly, just older somehow. For the first time in my life, Richard Bennett looked tired. "I spent 30 years building a reputation," he admitted quietly. "I thought success looked a certain way, structure, stability, respectability. And I threatened that. You rejected everything I understood." There it was. The truth. Not hatred, not disappointment. Fear. Fear that he no longer understood the world. Fear that his daughter succeeded outside systems he respected. Fear that traditional power no longer guaranteed relevance. I softened slightly then. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to finally see him clearly. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We thought we were protecting you." "From what?" She hesitated. "Failure." I nodded slowly. "And when success came anyway, suddenly I belonged to the family again." Neither of them answered. Because again, what could they possibly say? The room fell quiet except for distant waves beyond the terrace. Finally, my father looked up at me. "I am proud of you." The words should have meant everything. 10 years earlier they would have. But delayed love changes shape after enough time passes. I believed he meant it. That was the tragic part. He finally respected me now that the world did first. But something fragile had already died between us long before the gala. "You know what hurts the most?" I asked softly. My mother wiped beneath her eyes. "What?" "I would have traded every dollar I have for parents who loved me before I became successful." My father looked down immediately. And in that moment, the entire balance of power shifted permanently. Not because I was richer, not because I was famous. Because they finally understood the cost of what they lost. I walked toward the front door slowly and opened it. Not angrily. Just clearly. My mother stared at me. "You're asking us to leave." "I'm asking you to understand something," I said quietly. "You loved the version of me that made sense to your friends, not the woman I actually became." Tears rolled silently down my mother's face now. My father stood slowly. "We made mistakes." "Yes," I said, "you did." He nodded once. No argument left, no authority left, no control left. Just consequences. They walked toward the door together, looking smaller than I remembered. Older too. Right before stepping outside, my father turned back one last time. "I hope someday you forgive us." I looked at him for several long seconds, then answered honestly, "I already did." My mother's face crumpled slightly with relief. But I continued. That doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. Because forgiveness and access are not the same thing. They left quietly after that. No yelling, no dramatic ending. Just two people finally realizing too late that love with conditions eventually becomes loneliness. That evening I stood barefoot on the terrace watching the sun disappear into the Gulf while warm wind moved across the water. My phone buzzed constantly now, interviews, invitations, partnerships, media requests. But the messages that mattered most came from veterans. Widows, soldiers, military daughters, people who understood what it felt like to become strong without being fully loved first. Those were my people now. Not country clubs, not charity gossip, not carefully curated family reputations. Real people, honest people, people who stayed. 6 months later, the Claire Bennett Veterans Initiative opened its third housing center. 1 year later, I funded scholarships for military children entering cybersecurity and engineering programs. And every once in a while, usually late at night when the ocean is quiet and memories drift back in, I still think about that dinner table. About my father pointing toward the door. About the moment everything broke. Funny thing is, getting thrown out of that house turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Because sometimes rejection stops being rejection the moment you realize you were never asking the right people for permission in the first place. And if you've ever had someone underestimate you, dismiss you, or only love the version of you they could control, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not decrease because someone else failed to recognize it. If this story touched you in some way, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe in stories about resilience, dignity, and proving people wrong without losing your soul in the process, make sure you subscribe and stay with us for more journeys like this. Until next time, take care of yourself and never shrink just to fit inside somebody else's expectations.